I was never the kind of person to believe in true evil, not in the way people talk about it in movies or books. I always thought that cruelty had a reason behind it, a cause that could be explained. But what happened to me 8 years ago changed the way I look at the world. Some things don't have a reason, some things just are. And sometimes, the worst monsters wear human faces. It started with a Craigslist ad. I had just moved to a new city, desperate for a fresh start. My savings were running out, and I needed a place fast. The listing was simple. Room for rent, cheap, no deposit required. The kind of deal that should have set off alarms, but I was too naive to see them. The man who answered my email called himself Greg. He was in his late 40s, friendly, with the kind of voice that put you at ease. He told me he was looking for a roommate because his last one had moved out unexpectedly. Said he just wanted some company. I know it sounds weird, he admitted over the phone, but I don't like living alone, it gets too quiet. When I arrived at the house, it was smaller than I'd imagined, tucked away in a part of town that felt forgotten. The paint was peeling and the windows were dirty. Inside it was worse, dark, cramped, the air thick with the smell of something I couldn't quite place. Greg greeted me with a wide smile, shaking my hand like we were old friends. "Make yourself at home," he said, leading me to the spare bedroom. It was small but clean, and at that moment that was enough. The first few nights were uneventful. Greg mostly kept to himself, and I figured I'd lucked out. But then, small things started to bother me. The way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking, how he always seemed to know exactly where I was in the house. And then there were the noises, muffled thuds from his room late at night as if he was moving furniture around. One night, I woke up to the sound of something scraping against my bedroom door. I held my breath, heart pounding, until it stopped. I told myself I was imagining things. I had no other options, I couldn't afford to move again. So I ignored the red flags. Until the night I made a mistake. I'd gotten home late from work and was starving. Greg was out, so I went to the kitchen to find something to eat. That's when I saw it, his bedroom door slightly open. I told myself I'd just peek in, just to see what was inside. But the second I pushed the door wider, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. The smell hit me first, thick, putrid, metallic. The room was dark except for a small lamp on the desk, casting eerie shadows over the walls. And then I saw them. Boxes. Stacks of them, piled up against the walls, each one labeled with a name. I took a step closer, my stomach twisting into knots. The top box was slightly open, and inside I saw what looked like a folded piece of clothing. Hesitantly, I reached in, pulling out a crumpled shirt. And then I saw the dark stains. Dried. Old. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. My foot hit something and I looked down. A duffel bag, unzipped, just enough to reveal a glimpse of what was inside. Hair. Long, tangled and matted with something dark. I stumbled backward, knocking into the desk. My hand landed on something cold, metal, a knife, clean, sharp, waiting. That's when I heard it. A soft click, the sound of the front door closing. Panic surged through me as I turned off the lamp and scrambled to the closet, pressing myself into the darkness. I heard Greg's footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate. Then his voice. "You were home early tonight." I could hear the smile in his voice, and I knew then he had seen the open door. The next minutes felt like hours. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The sound of his footsteps crept closer, then stopped outside the room. The door creaked as he pushed it open. I squeezed my eyes shut. If he looked in the closet, it was over. But then a sudden knock at the front door. Greg froze. Another knock, louder this time, and then a voice. "Police, open up!" I didn't question how or why. I only knew that this was my only chance. As Greg turned, I threw myself out of the closet and ran. I didn't look at him. I didn't stop. I burst out of the house, nearly collapsing as I saw 2 officers standing on the porch. "Help me!" I screamed. What happened next was a blur. The police pushed past me, weapons drawn. I heard Greg yelling, something about a misunderstanding, but when they dragged him out in cuffs, His eyes met mine, and the smile was still there. Greg was already under a long investigation and was being watched. Luckily, the police decided to act at the best moment. The diary in his room revealed everything: the missing people, the remains, the trophies he had kept. Greg wasn't looking for a roommate. He was looking for his next victim. The last one had moved out unexpectedly, all right. They found her bones buried in the backyard. I don't think about that night often. I don't want to. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I still hear the scrape of something against my door, and I wonder how close I came to never opening it again. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of evening that feels like any other, mundane and forgettable. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban neighborhood where I lived. I was sitting in my living room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a faint knock at the door. It wasn't the confident rap of a delivery driver or the cheerful tap of a neighbor stopping by. It was hesitant, almost apologetic, as if the person on the other side wasn't sure they wanted to be heard at all. I paused, my thumb hovering over the screen, and listened. The knock came again, a little louder this time, but still uncertain. I stood up, my curiosity piqued, and walked to the door. What I saw when I opened it would change everything. Standing on my porch was a woman, probably in her late 30s, though she looked older. Her hair was disheveled, and her clothes were wrinkled as if she'd been wearing them for days. But it was her eyes that caught me off guard. They were wide, darting back and forth, and filled with a kind of raw, unfiltered fear that made my stomach twist. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, trembling slightly, as if she were trying to muster the courage to speak. I asked her if she was okay, if she needed help, and that's when she finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the words she said sent a chill down my spine. "I think someone's been living in my house." At first, I wasn't sure how to respond. It sounded like the kind of thing you'd hear in a bad horror movie, but the look on her face told me this was anything but fiction. I invited her inside partly because I didn't know what else to do, and partly because I didn't want to leave her standing there, exposed and vulnerable. She hesitated for a moment, glancing over her shoulder before stepping into my house. I led her to the couch and offered her a glass of water, which she accepted with shaking hands. As she sipped it, she began to tell me her story, and with every word, I felt the walls of my safe, ordinary world start to close in around me. Her name was Sarah, and she lived just a few blocks away. She'd moved into the house about 6 months ago, after a messy divorce left her needing a fresh start. At first, everything seemed fine. The house was small but cozy, and she'd been excited to make it her own. But then strange things started happening. Little things at first: a chair out of place, a door left slightly ajar, a faint smell she couldn't quite identify. She told herself she was just being paranoid, that she was still adjusting to living alone. But then the noises started. Soft, almost imperceptible creaks in the middle of the night, like someone was moving around in the attic. She'd go up to check, but there was never anything there, just dust and shadows. The breaking point came a week ago. She'd been lying in bed trying to fall asleep when she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone was gently knocking on the wall from the other side. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, and listened. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, almost like a code. She wanted to believe it was just the house settling, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. The next morning, she called a handyman to check the walls, but he found nothing. No pipes, no wires, no explanation for the sound. That's when she started to notice other things, small, subtle changes that made her skin crawl. A picture frame tilted slightly to the left, a book pulled halfway out of the shelf, a single strand of hair on her pillow that wasn't hers. By the time she finished speaking, her voice was trembling and her hands were clenched so tightly around the glass that her knuckles were white. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe she was overreacting, that her imagination was running wild, but the other part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I asked her if she'd gone to the police, and she nodded. They'd come by, done a quick walkthrough of the house, and told her there was no sign of forced entry or anything suspicious. They suggested she install security cameras and change the locks, but they didn't seem to take her seriously. I could see the frustration in her eyes as she told me this, the helplessness of someone who knows something is wrong but can't prove it. I offered to go back to her house with her, to help her look around and see if we could find anything the police might have missed. She hesitated at first, clearly torn between wanting to figure out what was going on and being terrified of what we might find. But eventually she agreed. We drove to her house in silence, the weight of her story hanging heavy in the air. When we got there, she unlocked the door with trembling hands and stepped inside, motioning for me to follow. The house was quiet, almost eerily so, and the air felt thick like it was holding its breath. We started in the living room, looking for anything out of the ordinary, but everything seemed normal. The furniture was in place, the windows were locked, and there were no signs of a break-in. But as we moved through the house, I began to notice small details that made my skin crawl. A faint scuff mark on the floor near the attic door, like something had been dragged across it. A small, almost imperceptible crack in the wall near the baseboard, as if someone had pried it open and then hastily put it back. And then there was the smell, a faint, musty odor that seemed to linger in the air no matter where we went. Sarah noticed it too, and I could see the fear in her eyes as she looked at me, silently pleading for an explanation I couldn't give. We decided to check the attic. Sarah led the way, her steps hesitant and slow, as if she were afraid of what we might find. The attic was dark and cramped, filled with boxes and old furniture, and the air was thick with dust. We moved carefully, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, but at first, everything seemed normal. Just a typical attic, cluttered and forgotten. But then I saw it, a small makeshift bed in the corner, hidden behind a stack of boxes. It was nothing more than a pile of blankets and a pillow, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. Someone had been sleeping up here. Someone had been living in her house. Sarah let out a choked sob, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at the bed. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? We stood there in silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on us, until Sarah finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the words were clear and filled with a kind of desperate resolve. "We need to call the police." I nodded, pulling out my phone, but as I dialed the number, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced around the attic, my flashlight sweeping across the shadows, but there was no one there. Just the dust and the darkness and the faint, musty smell that seemed to cling to everything. The police arrived quickly, their flashlights cutting through the night as they searched the house. They found more evidence, a stash of food and water hidden in the attic, a small hole in the wall that led to a crawl space, and a series of notes scribbled on scraps of paper detailing Sarah's daily routine. It was clear that whoever had been living in her house had been watching her, learning her habits, waiting for the right moment to make their move. The police assured her they would increase patrols in the area and keep an eye on her house, but they couldn't guarantee her safety. They suggested she stay somewhere else for a while, until they could figure out who was behind this. Sarah stayed with me that night, too shaken to go back to her house. We sat in my living room, the TV on, but neither of us really watching it, as we tried to process what had happened. I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she kept glancing at the door, as if she expected someone to come bursting through at any moment. I didn't blame her. I felt it too. The unease, the paranoia, the sense that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next few days were a blur. Sarah moved in with a friend, and I helped her pack up her things, careful to avoid the attic and the crawl space where the intruder had been hiding. The police continued their investigation, but they didn't find much. It was as if the person had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their presence. But the damage was done. Sarah's sense of security was shattered, and she couldn't bring herself to go back to the house. She ended up selling it a few months later at a loss just to be rid of it. As for me, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I found myself double-checking the locks on my doors, glancing over my shoulder when I walked to my car, and jumping at every little noise. It wasn't just the idea of someone living in Sarah's house that haunted me. It was the realization that we're never really as safe as we think we are. That there are people out there who can slip into our lives unnoticed, who can watch us and learn our habits and wait for the right moment to strike. And the scariest part? We might never even know they're there until it's too late. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but enough time has passed that I can finally talk about what happened that winter night in rural Montana. Sometimes I still wake up in cold sweats, remembering the sound of crunching snow and that haunting silence that followed. The events I'm about to describe took place in December 2019, and they changed how I view humanity forever. I was working as a long-haul train conductor for Burlington Northern Santa Fe, running the night route between Whitefish and Havre. It was a lonely job, but it paid well, and I enjoyed the solitude of the mountains. That particular night, the temperature had dropped to -20, and the snow was coming down in thick, heavy flakes that made visibility almost non-existent beyond the train's headlights. Around 2 a.m., we were passing through a particularly remote stretch of track when my engineer, Mike, spotted something unusual on the rails ahead. As we slowed the train, we could make out what looked like an abandoned car stuck on the crossing. Protocol dictated that we stop and investigate. We couldn't risk a collision, and there might have been someone in need of help. Looking back now, I wish we'd just kept going. The car was an old Ford Explorer, covered in a fresh layer of snow. No tracks led to or from it, which struck me as odd. It was as if the vehicle had materialized out of thin air. Mike radioed our position to dispatch while I grabbed my flashlight and heavy coat. The wind was brutal as I made my way down the locomotive's steps, the beam of my light cutting through the darkness like a knife. As I approached the vehicle, I noticed all its doors were closed, but the driver's side window was completely shattered. Glass fragments glittered in the snow like tiny diamonds. The interior was empty, no signs of blood or struggle, just an open purse on the passenger seat and a child's backpack in the rear. The engine was cold. This car had been here for hours. That's when I heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams. A soft whimper carried on the wind, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the crossing. I swept my flashlight in that direction and caught a glimpse of something red moving behind a snow-covered pine tree. "Hello?" I called out, my voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "This is the railroad police. Do you need help?" The whimpering grew louder, and I could now make out what sounded like a child's voice. Every instinct told me to get back on the train, but I couldn't live with myself if I left a kid out here to freeze to death. I radioed Mike to call the local sheriff's department and slowly made my way toward the sound, my boots crunching in the knee-deep snow. As I rounded the pine tree, my blood turned to ice. There was indeed a child there, a little girl, probably no more than 7 or 8, wearing a red winter coat. She was kneeling in the snow, her back to me, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "Hey there," I said softly, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" She didn't respond or turn around, just kept crying. I took another step closer, and that's when I noticed something that made my heart stop. There were no footprints in the snow around her, none at all. She was just there, as if she'd fallen from the sky. Before I could process what this meant, she slowly began to turn her head toward me, movements jerky and unnatural like a broken puppet. I don't remember running back to the train. Mike said I was screaming something about the girl when I burst into the cab, but I have no memory of that. What I do remember is what we saw in the beam of the locomotive's headlights as we began to pull away. The little girl was standing by the crossing now, completely still, face hidden in shadow. But she wasn't alone anymore. There were others with her, dark figures emerging from behind trees and snowbanks, moving in ways that human bodies shouldn't be able to move. Some crawled on all fours, others seemed to glide across the snow without leaving tracks. All of them were headed toward the train. Mike threw the throttle forward, and we accelerated as fast as we safely could. I could have sworn I heard laughter mixing with the wind, high-pitched, childlike giggles that made my skin crawl. We didn't stop until we reached the next station, where we reported everything to the authorities. The police investigation found the Ford Explorer belonged to a Sarah Martinez, who had been reported missing, along with her daughter Emma 3 days earlier. They had been traveling to visit family in Kalispell when they disappeared. The car was exactly where we'd found it, but there was no sign of the girl in the red coat or any of the other figures we'd seen. Here's the detail that still keeps me up at night. When they searched the car more thoroughly, they found Emma's red winter coat in the trunk, neatly folded, the same coat I'd seen the girl wearing in the snow. I quit my job with the railroad the following week. I couldn't face those dark stretches of track anymore, couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there waiting. The official report blamed everything on hysteria and poor visibility conditions, but Mike and I know what we saw that night. The strangest part. 6 months later, I received a letter postmarked from Kalispell. Inside was a child's crayon drawing showing a train, some trees, and several dark figures standing in the snow. In the corner, written in wobbly letters, "Thank you for stopping to help us." The return address didn't exist. I still check the news regularly for any updates on Sarah and Emma Martinez, but their case remains unsolved. Sometimes on cold winter nights when the wind howls just right, I think I hear that childlike giggling again, and I wonder about all those other missing persons cases in remote areas, all those unexplained disappearances along lonely stretches of road and rail. How many other conductors have stopped to help someone in need, only to find something else entirely waiting in the darkness? I don't work nights anymore, and I avoid driving in snowstorms whenever possible, but mostly, I've learned this. Sometimes, when you see someone who needs help, the kindest thing you can do is keep going. Because not everything that asks for help actually needs it, and not everything that appears human is.